Jeff Sharlet is with me this morning, New York Times best-selling author of a number of books examining the intersection of power and religion in America. He's been studying that for more than a decade. His latest book is called The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War, and it involved a year-long expedition into the American far right. He's also a professor of writing at Dartmouth College, and he's in Hanover, New Hampshire this morning. What a pleasure, Professor, to welcome you to our program. Keen interest in hearing what you have to say on this issue today. Welcome.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning.
I'd like to begin by asking your impressions of Kamala Harris and her closing argument speech last night. Looking at your social media posts from last night, you seem to find it lacking, a missed opportunity that was a sort of a standard stump speech, as you said, when she needed to do so much more. What did you find specifically lacking?
Too little, too late is my assessment. And, you know, if you went and you looked at right-wing media that say, what is Kamala doing campaigning in Washington, which is not a swing state, here at the end? The same as liberals on the left are saying, what is Trump doing campaigning in New York? They're both getting on national primetime television. She had a primetime television. Fox News, our right-wing network, cut away from Laura Ingraham to cover this. And we heard the same formulations that we've heard in the stump speech, which whatever you think of it, hasn't sealed the deal. She called him remind us of viscerally what's at stake, narratively what's at stake, the story of what fascism has been and can be under a much even stronger Trump regime.
So we just had a little audio dropout, Professor. I'm really sorry. I think you said you were talking about how it was a standard stump speech, and she didn't go on, I think you were saying, to highlight to the degree you would have liked to have heard the threat to democracy which Donald Trump poses. And then you use the word fascism. She did not attack him using that word. She did say he was unstable, that he was obsessed with revenge. She did say he was a threat to democracy. It was strong, but it wasn't the wording that we're hearing now. So should she have gone farther, do you think?
She's using the very terms that his supporters, and even some of his supporters, say, well, I don't like his character, but he's ruthless. And they're describing ruthless as a good quality. And I think that marks, in some ways, the shift toward a really fascist movement, which is now we admire the strong man, not for his virtue, but for his vices, for his unpredictability, for his promise of vengeance. So to simply say, oh, this is that thing that some 47% of America has decided that they like is not enough. This is where we get into the old truth of politics: is you have to tell stories. So
the fact that you've used sorry, go ahead. You have used that, and you posted this, and you've used this word. We have now, maybe thanks to John Kelly's recording, this has really entered the lexicon of the campaign discussion of late. So fascist and fascism, is it the appropriate use at this time? It's a marked change, really, in the vocabulary we use in covering elections.
Well, I'm a journalist, but I'm also an academic, so I'll defer to the scholars of this field, Timothy Snyder, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and probably the dean of these studies, Robert O. Paxton, a historian of Vichy France, who resisted the F word during the first administration, said these are authoritarian tendencies, and describes instead now a movement toward fascism, which is really defined above all by a cult of personality. It's not enough just to have right-wing, very far-right politics. A cult of personality, and not just the use of violence, but the idea that violence itself can be a form of pleasure, and which is what you're hearing, which is what you heard at Madison Square Garden. Not just we're going to hit back, but this idea that for the believers, for the Trumpers, it will feel good to inflict pain.
We were talking last hour, beginning with the starting point of the Kamala Harris rally. And on social media, you talked about how you wanted to see more from her. You posted she needs to use this event live on prime time after a clear fascist rally to do more than the stump speech. I want to begin this talk with what you referenced there, the clear fascist rally. That's a reference to Sunday in New York City, Donald Trump and his supporter. What did you see on Sunday to describe it that way?
so much attention being paid to those racist remarks about Puerto Ricans, which are par for the course for Trump rallies, which I've been covering for 8 years. But you looked at Stephen Miller, his immigration advisor, who moved their slogan from American First. He actually said, he said, now it's Americans only. That's a real escalation. One of the largest sort of crowd response moments is when Trump was promising more executions for those those whom he calls illegals, and we had the crowd chanting USA, USA, and that's a key sort of element of what we understand as fascism, not just violence, but the idea of vengeance and the idea of somehow, for the believer, that actually being a form of pleasure to anticipate the death of others.
One of the other things we saw during that rally was one of the speakers brandishing a cross and referring to Kamala Harris as the Antichrist. That also received tremendous support. So let's speak about the intersection of this with what is your clear area of expertise. As you said, this is white Christian nationalism. You've been studying this for years. How significant a force is it right now in the Trump campaign?
We're going to find out in a few days. He has, I think, what we can say the evangelical right vote locked up. We often refer to that as white Christian nationalism. It's worth noting that he's expanded that beyond just white folks. There's a kind of Christian nationalism that has a strong gravity, and he's really consolidated it to the point where, traveling around the country in the United States now, I kept encountering churches that are arming up militias, and not just red states like Nebraska, but blue states like California. And it's a different vision of what Christianity is. I think of one quite powerful church in California that no longer had the cross, because they said now is a time for a war church, and the cross is for times of peace. Their pulpit was made of swords. They gifted their pastor an AR-15. So that's the base he's appealing to, and will they come out in the numbers he needs? I don't know.
Has that changed? As you mentioned, you've been covering Trump rallies for 8 years. Has what you've observed within that movement, has it changed?
It has changed. There was that question in 2016, would he be able to sort of seal the deal with Mike Pence as a kind of the proxy for a different kind of Christian right? He did, and they crossed over. There's almost a theological change in right-wing Christian nationalist circles, and an expansion. And one of the things I think people outside of this, they imagine Christian nationalism as people only being going to church. At Trump rallies, people cheer for the idea of a Christian nation, people who don't go to church. It's become a way to signal your nationalism, not necessarily your faith or your piety. And this was true on January 6th. So many of those who raided the White House invoked Jesus and were not churchgoers or religious people at all. They mean something rooted in this man, Trump.
So how do they view Trump then, those in this movement? Is he their leader? Or I've heard the word used to describe him often as a vessel.
There's a vessel, there's the idea of an anointing. I mean, and these, again, are old ideas in American politics. What no politician at this level has been able to do before is to sort of so displace the centrality for even the most conservative Christian of Christ, so that there can be almost a conflation. Now, there are a fair number of people who see Trump as some kind of divine messenger, but even those who don't, you'll see God, God, guns, and Trump, or images of Trump sort of with Jesus and a ghost-like figure hovering above him, or something called the battle verse, which is from the book of Joshua 1:9, which is sort of invoking somehow this idea of a holy war that Trump is fighting to save the United States. And what's really fascinating is he's managed to sort of tar and brand migrants to the United States, so many of whom are, in fact, quite devout Christians, as somehow other than American Christians. So they are a threat to the Christianity of America for his believers.
So as you look at, I'm sorry, we're going to have to conclude it after this question, just a little bit disjointed because of the technical issue, but you have called this a global fascist movement. And as you look at what you've seen on Sunday and what you're talking and describing today, we're not talking about these issues very often, I don't think, in this campaign. What frightens you most? What concerns you most? And what is the message that people have to hear in these next 6 days?
I think there's sort of this imagination in the United States. There's an imagination Canadians are very familiar with, that if there's really terrible trouble, we'll go to Canada. You have your own right-wing politics there, but more to the point, we look at Germany and France, powerful far-right and even fascist movements. We look at nations like the Philippines. We look at nations like Brazil, which has been struggling. It's not currently in that. And of course, we look at regimes like Putin's or Modi's in India. And we see this kind of authoritarianism, cult of personality globally. I would like us to see this as an existential crisis, not just for this election in the United States, but this is a struggle for the future of the planet and how we're going to think about it and how we're going to move forward in this century.
Jeffrey Sharlet, thank you so much, and thank you for your patience in coming back. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and you've given us much to think on. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Heather.